or personality or just your style or my style or whatever.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Hope Talks. If this is your first time joining us, or if you've joined us before, I want to say thank you for tuning in. Welcome back. And thank you for joining us if it's your first time. So, as always, make sure to leave us comments. Let us know that you're here, where you're joining us from, all that good stuff. If you have any questions, leave that all in the comments. I'll be reviewing those. It's a little difficult for me to look at them while we're live, but I will be reviewing them shortly after we're done here today. So I'm going to give just a few minutes for people to join and get settled while we're waiting. I encourage you to please share this stream. There's a button in the bottom right hand corner that says share. If you click that, it'll give you the option to share this onto your own page, or if you manage a business page, you can share it there too. If you are affiliated with any Facebook groups, you can share this there. Anywhere that you think there might be people who are interested in tuning in today, please share. So for anyone that's new, my name is Catherine. I am the Development and Communications Coordinator for Southside Center of Hope, and I am the host of Hope Talks. So Southside Center of Hope, for those of you who don't know, is a nonprofit recovery home for women in Chicago. We provide housing and supportive services for single women and women with children who are experiencing homelessness and are in recovery from addiction. And Hope Talks is something that we started actually just over a year ago. And we have Hope Talks on the third Monday of each month at 1 p.m. Central Time. We do Hope Talks live, and the purpose of this live stream is to share community resources and have really important and valuable conversations on topics that impact our community. So, today, we'll actually be joined by two guests, which is something that we don't normally do, but I was able to connect with two really amazing women who were very excited to join us today to discuss the connection between post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, and addiction. So we'll be joined today by Sarah. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce her last name, Buino, Sarah Buino. She is the president of Head Heart Therapy. And then we will also be joined by Gabriella Zapata-Alma, who is the director of policy and practice on domestic violence and substance use at the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. So Sarah and Gabriella will be joining us to talk about PTSD, build some awareness, and also to talk about the connection between PTSD and addiction. So I'm going to go ahead and bring in our guests now. I want to say thank you again for joining us. Please share this live stream with your networks and leave us any comments. Let's see if we can get them in here.
Hey.
Hello.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thank you both for joining me today. I'm really excited to have two guests today. I think it's going to just really add to the capacity of our conversation. I introduced you both briefly, but I want to give you an opportunity to do that yourselves as well. So Sarah, if you would like to start, and just both of you, I'd love to hear, just who you are, what you do, and kind of just, the expertise that you will be able to offer us today as we discuss PTSD.
Sure. So my name is Sarah Buino, and I own the practice Head Heart Therapy. And I think there are about 11 of us clinicians now, all specializing in addiction or trauma. And the main training where I've gotten a lot of my trauma expertise is called NARM, Neuroaffective Relational Model. And it really actually focuses on complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So I'm excited to talk specifically about that.
Perfect. Thank you. And Gabriella?
Thanks so much. So I'm Gabriella Zapata-Alma. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and also a certified alcohol and other drug counselor. And I work for the National Center on Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health. And before coming to the National Center, and there I focus specifically on the intersection of intimate partner violence and substance use. But before coming to the center, I was a director of formal outpatient, intensive outpatient treatment for substance use conditions, as well as co-occurring mental health conditions. And then I also spent over a decade working in the housing field, working with folks who are experiencing different forms of housing instability, as well as interpersonal and structural violence.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I want to start just like with a baseline, if we can, define post-traumatic stress disorder. And then if you also could talk a little bit about, the signs and symptoms or the effects of PTSD, just very broadly.
Who wants to start? Well, I can give the simple definition that I think of in terms of trauma is it's a normal response to an abnormal situation, essentially, that, I think we might think of trauma symptoms as like, oh, I'm crazy, or I shouldn't be feeling this way. And other people might, put us in that category too, but it's actual, the body and the mind's reaction to something overwhelming, overstimulating, and painful. So it is a normal reaction.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah. And you plucked the words right out of my brain. Trauma, or the effects of trauma, are our body's natural coping responses to try to do our best in protecting ourselves. And so there's nothing about shame there. There's nothing around blame. And while the felt experience can sometimes feel very scary and can feel like out of control, there's nothing to fear there, because it is our body's responses to trying to keep us as well as possible. And so, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is only a very, very small slice of the ways that trauma can show up in our lives, in our relationships, in our experience of self, in our society as a whole, right? In our histories. So it's only a very small kind of portion of it. And it's mostly based on acute trauma, a trauma that has a beginning, middle, and end, where you can point to something and go, this thing happened, or this thing was done to me, right? And so that's only a very, very small part of the kinds of harm that we may come to be exposed to or experience, both individually as well as within our ancestry and our lineage and within our society. And so a framework that I have found really helpful in understanding trauma and understanding substance use and mental health kind of threat responses is something called the Power Threat Meaning Framework. And so I invite everyone to check that out. There's like a 200+ page manual available for free online. So there's plenty there to find. But what it does, it invites us to reflect on how is power kind of moved in this person's life, both their access to power, their experience of marginalization, and all the different kinds of power, from kind of on that individual level to a societal level. From there, what's been the impact of that power? What kinds of threats has that posed for the person? And again, that is like nesting dolls. It's reflects the small all the way to the large. And then from there, the meaning. Both what's the kind of societal meaning that we ascribe to this? Are we living in a culture of victim blaming? Are we, what is the meaning that we ascribe to this, both as a culture and as a society, as well as individuals? And this is where sometimes we see things like, I am bad, I am worthless, or the world is dangerous. You can't trust anybody, right? That's where you see some of that meaning coming up. And then through understanding all of these kind of big picture pieces that intersect in someone's life, then you have the building blocks to even start to understand the way that threat responses might be showing up for them, only within the context of how they have aided somebody in their survival.
And I think too, something else that I wanted to touch on as we're kind of defining PTSD, I think, you know, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think for some people, there's this expectation that, you know, PTSD is a direct and immediate result of, you know, a major event, a lot, you know, something that we would define as being, you know, very traumatic. You touched on a little bit, kind of, you know, kind of ancestral, you know, things that are passed down, things that move a little bit slower, things that maybe we can't even identify. So I did want to just take time to discuss that very briefly as well. PTSD is not always, like you said, you know, an event and then an immediate, you know, reaction or effect. It can build up over time. It can be really difficult to identify. So that's just kind of my perspective. If you all have anything to share related to that, you're welcome to.
Yeah, if it's okay for me to jump in. I wonder if it would be helpful, instead of us saying PTSD throughout this, is just saying trauma, because PTSD just happens to be one of, I think, is it just 2 diagnoses that we have in the DSM for trauma right now? When, as Gabriella said, there is a whole lot more stuff that goes under the umbrella. And complex post-traumatic stress disorder is, you know, I heard Gabriella already alluding to this, but there's, so if something is a shock trauma, which is, you know, somebody being in war or a car accident or a sexual assault, right, that would result in PTSD because there's an actual threat to someone's life, or a very high perceived threat to someone's life. Complex post-traumatic stress disorder, on the other hand, is a result of things that we can't point to necessarily because it didn't have a beginning and an end. It might be something that happened throughout someone's life, or it could have been a short period of time, but it's less tangible. And what that often results in is a sense of badness, is shame, truly. And in NARM, the way we talk about trauma and our responses to trauma is, it's not the thing that happened to us, but it's the way that we relate to ourselves based on what happened to us. And with complex post-traumatic stress disorder, what we're really hoping to help folks do is start to relate to themselves in a more compassionate and loving way, instead of the shaming, self-hating, you know, and self-harm, which addiction falls under self-harm, right?
And, you know, just from the research that I've done in preparation for this conversation, I did find that trauma, and specifically post-traumatic stress disorder, is one of the most common co-occurring conditions among people with substance use disorders. And, you know, I think that shows itself in a few different ways. But I did want to ask you both just to talk a little bit about how you perceive addiction and trauma being connected. I know that probably is, you know, a pretty deep dive, but that is, you know, the bulk of our conversation today. So I want to start broad, and then we can, you know, kind of build off of that.
Sure. So there is, I would say that there's a lot of interconnectedness. So it's not a unidirectional relationship. It's not even just a direction in 2 different ways. It's really something that can be interwoven. And so when we think about that, you know, national surveys show that the vast majority of people who use substances do not go on to develop a diagnosable substance use disorder or be in need of treatment, right? Or formal treatment, I should say. That there are many people who use substances and either never develop a substance use disorder, or at some point do meet criteria for a substance use disorder and then just kind of age out of it. That the vast majority of people who do recover, or kind of spontaneously recover from a substance use disorder, do so without ever meeting a formal treatment provider. And so I start there to say that there's a lot about our relationships with substances that we haven't really researched yet. We don't really know a lot about because of the stigma associated with substance use disorder. That it's really not until somebody has developed a very typically significant substance use disorder that we start really researching it or talking about it. And so in that way, a lot of times within our society, there's kind of this equating substance use with substance use related disorders, right? So just kind of broadening out the perspective there. When it comes to trauma, trauma is then creating a situation where we are in need of some self-soothing, of something that can help us feel in contact with ourselves, with others, feel safe in our bodies, feel safer in our environments, right? And because it's not like we have yet to be able to create a truly trauma-informed or safe society, that kind of sources of threat are really complex and ongoing, especially once we add on the layers of things like experiencing housing instability, experiencing food scarcity, trying to get help and then experiencing discrimination from a provider, right? All of the different harms that kind of get layered on. And so understanding that substance use isn't, here I'm going to quote Dr. Gabor Mate, that substance use is not the problem, although it may have become a problem, but that the substance use is actually an attempt at a solution. And, working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence, and many times historical trauma, many different kinds of intersecting interpersonal and structural violence, what I've heard time and time again is that even though the substances were a problem for them, a self-identified problem in their life, that it was also something that saved their life at one point or another. So there is really deep connections with trauma and substance use. And so before I pass it along, the thing I'll say is that we focus a lot on the substance use and we miss the healing.
Yeah.
And focus on the healing, the substance use, we will find our way with that, right?
Yeah, beautifully stated. And what I would just add to that, specifically to say everyone has trauma. It's really on a spectrum. As Gabriella said, we're not in a safe society. We're not in a society that supports mental health and healing, right? There's treatment and then there's healing. And until we really fuse those two, then we might not actually be getting to the root of the issue. One thing I wanted to add in my work with folks who struggle with substance use disorders. So these would be people who identify as, having a substance use disorder, being diagnosed, going through treatment for that. I noticed two types of people, essentially two camps. One is people will readily say, I started using drugs and alcohol because I was traumatized, I had pain, I was depressed, or whatever, that they were going for that self-soothing. And then there seems to be this other camp of folks who will say, I didn't have any problems in my childhood, in my life. I just started using for fun. And then somehow these two folks kind of go together. But what it turns out, oftentimes, once somebody's gone through a period of healing, is that the folks who say they started using for fun then begin to recognize actually there was trauma underneath all along that they didn't have any awareness of, either because it was, whether it was sort of denial or whether it was more just unrecognizable trauma, more of this complex post-traumatic stress disorder sort of stuff, developmental trauma. And, my hope in having conversations like this and continuing to work in the industry is really that more people are able to identify their trauma so that they can move towards healing, so that they can access support.
And, one thing that Gabriella mentioned was, that substance use for some people, might be a saving grace at some point in their journey. And I think that that's something that, in our work, we see a lot too, that maybe, you know, in the beginning, substances were being used as a way of kind of managing the symptoms of PTSD, maybe even, you know, numbing a little bit, just to kind of keep things moving. And then, you know, it does eventually at some point turn into a secondary issue that needs to be addressed. But I did want to talk about, you know, since we do so often see women struggling with PTSD and turning to substance use, you know, just in your professional opinion, what are some ways that women could overcome or manage trauma responses without turning to substance use?
I guess my initial reaction is I don't like to use the word overcome necessarily, only because it feels like there's like an end point, and I don't necessarily think that we're never healed, right? We're never going to show up one day and all of our problems are going to be gone, and all of our, you know, mental health issues will be in the past. So I would say, and manage, I don't know, there's something about the word manage that also doesn't feel right for me, but moving back into connection with oneself is how I would put it. Because I think trauma really disconnects us from ourselves and the world around us. And the problem with trauma is that it makes it really hard to be in the present moment. It doesn't feel safe. And I mean, my hope is that we continue to build more safe spaces and create more access. Because I know one of the questions that's coming is, you know, well, what do people do to get help? And part of the problem in this moment in time right now is that so many people are seeking services. There aren't enough service providers. And so my hope is that we can continue to get, you know, legislators on board to recognize that mental health is important, and the decision makers who are spending money on things, getting them to put money towards mental health so that there are safe spaces that women can turn to instead of turning to drugs and alcohol.
Yeah. And what I would add to that is that there are so many ways that we can experience responses to trauma, and we're still mapping all of those out. Even understanding that, you know, kind of not being able to accept help from others and needing to be really fiercely independent is part of a trauma response, and what it means to place trust in somebody else, right? And how we need to have a measure of vulnerability and a sense of kind of taking that risk in order to accept help from somebody else. And so there's so many ways that trauma impacts us and can show up. And kind of part of the beauty is that the ways of healing are also infinite. And that the different sources of healing, the different things that we find helpful, and the different times that things that may have been helpful for me in my journey 10 years ago are not necessarily the same things that are helpful today. And so really being able to embrace multiple pathways of healing, being able to embrace when someone says to us, you know what, that thing I'm not interested in, but this other thing I am interested in. I remember talking with somebody who said that, you know, they had gotten kicked out of every treatment program they had ever accessed, but that the most healing thing for them was to actually build community and to just connect with people as just another community member, right? And so there's a lot that needs to be improved in our systemic responses for folks, both in trauma prevention and then responding to the effects of trauma. And I think that embracing multiple pathways of healing, understanding that people have been doing healing work for millennia. And so for some people, that's going to mean, you know, turning up the music as loud as I can stand it, or as loud as my neighbors can stand it, and like dancing wildly in my room, right? That in that moment is healing for me, and is a way that I either don't need to engage in substance use, or don't need to engage in substance use in a way that isn't aligned with my other goals and my overall well-being. right? Because a lot of times we also tend to focus on a narrative of healing and recovery that is only focused on complete and total abstinence from substances. And for some people, absolutely, that is how they have defined their recovery for themselves. That is a modality of recovery that works for them. And we also know that there are so many different ways that people engage recovery, and that when we only define it as complete abstinence, we actually are silencing a lot of the beautiful stories of healing and recovery. A lot of people who would say, yeah, I used to have that problem, but I don't consider myself in recovery because I don't fit in that definition, right? And when we're really limiting it and silencing voices, we're also limiting the possibilities for someone to see themselves reflected in of what's possible for them. What are all the different ways that we heal, right? And so embracing the multiple pathways of recovery, embracing recovery capital, right? By Bill White, and I'm forgetting their first name, but last name Cloud, talking about, all the internal and external resources that aid us in our journey of recovery, community, social relationships, the physical pieces, things like having a safe place to live, having the finances, having stable food access, being able to access effective and culturally responsive treatment and trauma-informed treatment, right? And then the human dimension, our hope, our core values, our talents, right? That all of that plays a role. And so I tend to focus on, what I find that when we focus on cutting out the substances, there's a lot of feeling of just fear that gets kicked up.
Yeah.
And that when we can focus instead on building towards what it is that the life that we want, building on what is working, building on that rediscovery of self, as Sarah was saying, that connection with self, connection within community, then we start seeing that the substances are either less and less kind of looked towards, or if and when they are looked towards, they're in a way that aren't really causing a lot of harm to the person's overall well-being.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
And I'll add one more thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is actually a quote from a survivor, and I wanted to share it, and it just kind of, it just seems kind of this is the right moment. And a survivor panelist on one of our sessions was asked, what was the most healing thing for you in treatment? And one of the panelists responded, when a counselor said to me, when she had entered treatment, when a counselor said to me, thank goodness you had something to get you through that. No matter what, you are not at fault for someone else's decisions. You deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. Right? So talk about anti-stigma and non-shaming.
Yeah.
How many women who are trauma survivors meet a counselor who say, thank goodness you had something to get you through that?
Right. And we talk about that a lot in our work as well, just making sure it's, one of our top priorities is making sure that the women that we serve, they do live on site with us, and just making sure, like you said, that they have the most dignified lifestyle that they're able to have while they're with us. It just really makes such a difference when these women are used to kind of being, looked down on or not looked at all. To come into a space and really be able to feel safe for the first time in a long time, to have, nice, just food that they want to eat, clothes that they want to wear. Those are experiences that a lot of people are not able to access when they enter a treatment program or enter a shelter system. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. There's nothing that makes anyone undeserving of anything, in my opinion. So I just wanted to say that because that just kind of struck a chord with me. And so, as I guess that's a good point to transition, in our program, you know, we like to, you know, be very holistic. We're not just treating substance use. We're not just treating behavioral and mental health diagnoses. We're not just providing workforce training, or, you know, we want to help our residents, the women that we serve, you know, heal their whole selves, address their whole selves, learn to love their whole selves again. And so I did want to talk a little bit. I know that you both have touched on that quite a bit, but I wanted to ask you directly, you know, when a person does begin, you know, any sort of treatment, whether addiction is involved or not, why do you find that it is important to look at the whole self rather than just focusing on one specific issue? I think people might, you know, think I'm going to go to therapy because this one thing happened to me and I'm going to get over it and then I'm going to move forward. But, you know, that's not the case, and things boil over into other parts of our lives. So I just, like I said, wanted to kind of hear your perspective on taking that holistic approach, and, you know, if that's, if you agree with it, or if you, maybe you don't, but just what are your thoughts?
I would just say it's all connected. It's all connected. And so something that I think about when when I've been doing direct practice is that if somebody is raising something with me, if somebody is sharing something with me, even if on the surface it seems like I'm not clear on how that might hook into their goals, or kind of what they originally were coming in for some assistance with, to know that there is absolutely a reason why they're sharing it with me, their counselor, in this context. And so it's always connected, because we are one person. Mm-hmm. Bearing witness to one life for now. There may be more later, who knows, but I don't know, at least. But so it's, you know, so much of what we're doing really is helping people to connect, to reconnect, to connect in new ways, maybe for the first time, and to build those new connections, both internally and externally. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times what we're talking about is really integration of the self as well. And that extends even beyond the individual, especially if we're talking at all about collective trauma, historical trauma. The healing is also multi-generational and collective. And so, so it's absolutely, and the evidence bears that out, right? That integrated, comprehensive, holistic services yield better results for people.
Yeah, I would add too, I really think about, SAMHSA has I don't know what you call it, an initiative called 8 Areas of Wellness. And it's concentric circles, and it involves spiritual, financial, occupational, emotional, mental, like all of these different levels of healing. And we can't just pluck one thing out and expect, you know, everything not to be affected. It's just like family systems theory, right? If somebody, you know, shoves the identified patient into the therapy room, the whole system is going to change. So I think about that in terms of working with individuals as well, you know, and sometimes people will come in and they will say, you know, I'll have a client be like, well, I'm not sleeping and XYZ is the issue that I'm not sleeping. But through the process of therapy, we actually uncover that there's something totally different that they didn't recognize. And I think part of that is just, you know, keep a general consumer's, layperson's understanding of mental health and what affects it and whatnot. So I think there's just so many intersections. We can't pluck the things out.
Yeah.
And what's really beautiful about those interconnections is that also means that we meet people where they are and start wherever they are. Because, you know, sometimes I get the question of like, well, what do I do if somebody, you know, doesn't want to talk about their substance use, but we feel it in the room with us, right? Like it's happening, and it's, you know, bringing up some hardship. what's really beautiful is that everything is interconnected within a person. So starting where they are, focusing on whatever they want to focus on is going to have those positive ripple effects in other areas of their life. Hence recovery capital, right? There's nothing in recovery capital that says take control of somebody and make them talk about their substance use with you.
Right.
No.
Right. So when we talk about recovery from addiction, we know that that is a lifelong journey. There's like you had said earlier, there's really no end point. Your recovery journey, and it's unique to each person. And so I wanted to ask you both, if you find that recovering from trauma, living with PTSD with a PTSD diagnosis is a similar experience. Do you see people who kind of get to a point where it's gone, or, I don't believe that's probably the case, but I'm just interested, your opinions on, is that something that you have to work on? Like when we talk about addiction, you have to work on that pretty much every day for most people. Do you find that recovering from trauma is the same?
Shall I jump in? I can speak to my own journey of trauma healing, and I consider myself a person in recovery from trauma. And I continue in my, and it's funny, like I'm not working on my trauma. I'm really working on reconnecting to myself and being gentle and kind and loving towards myself. And for me, I spent a lot of time judging and shaming myself. And there was a period, there was a moment really where it shifted, and I no longer am judging myself as harshly as I was. And so that particular period of time made my recovery look different. And now I continue to peel more layers away is what happens for me. And I see that with a lot of my clients too. Like the healing gets deeper the more I'm able to allow myself to like be in contact with my aliveness and what animates me essentially. And in NARM, we really talk about moving towards ourselves. And it's also scary to move towards ourselves because that's usually why we were hurt and punished as children. And so I think that it's kind of like, I don't know, we weave in and out of it for the rest of our lives, I think. And for me, the volume gets turned down on certain, I guess we could call them triggers or whatever. The volume gets turned down over time, but sometimes it gets turned up again. And it's not linear. And we humans are so silly in the way we love to think that it's like, okay, this starts here and then I'm going to end here and I'm healed. And I feel the same. Like I'm a therapist. I know this, I have spiritual practices, and yet I still get caught up in that desire for there to be an ending. And that's just not how healing works. So I do think it's a continuing process that unfolds and weaves and moves and changes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I would add, so yes, to everything that Sarah shared. Yes, yes, yes. And I would add that, I don't, in my experience, I haven't seen substance use, like diagnosable substance use disorders, to always have to be something that is lifelong. I've also seen people have permanent exit. And it's just like any other kind of mental health experience where there are some folks where, engaging around treating their depression or anxiety may be a lifelong endeavor. And for some people, it's not, right? And there is a resolution, and there may still be things that they do to maintain their well-being, just like we all are maintaining our well-being throughout our lives, right? And so when it comes to trauma, I would say with PTSD, there absolutely can be resolution where somebody does not experience the effects of trauma in the way that is diagnosable for PTSD. And so using my own experience, I am somebody who has survived both complex chronic trauma since childhood, as well as somebody who experienced acute trauma throughout my young adulthood and some of my adolescence, but young adulthood mostly. And it wasn't until that acute trauma that I met a diagnosable disorder of post-traumatic stress disorder. And the PTSD absolutely, thankfully, was able to be resolved. And it's not something that shows up in my life. It's not something that I need to really kind of put things in place to manage or deal with, or any of the kind of words that we use around diagnosable conditions. The complex trauma starting in not only just my childhood, but in my ancestral line, going back several generations, actually as far back as I could trace, that is ongoing work because that is work of generations. And it is, I've experienced it the same way that Sarah described, that it is layers, it is deepening, it is, and that through those layers and deepening, I have also found myself navigating, healing my ancestors, past and future. And so then working with somebody who doesn't just have a lens of a medical model of trauma or an acute model of trauma, but has much more of a holistic vision of trauma and a generational and a decolonized vision of trauma has been really important in my ongoing trauma healing. And that I do think is lifelong because it spans times.
And I think that just points out too that it really is a different process for everybody, whether it's healing from substance use disorders or healing from trauma. And I suppose I want folks that are listening to this who might be shaming themselves for not being healed from their trauma yet, like that your journey is your journey. And I wish that we could have a magic wand and know when the end point was going to happen, but we just don't. And it might come to a resolution like Gabriella shared, and it might not. It might be a lifelong thing. And so not beat it, because we can shame ourselves for shaming ourselves. We can beat ourselves up for beating ourselves up. And that just adds to the barriers to healing when we're getting in our own way.
Mm-hmm. And so for, people who might be watching today or watching any other time, this will be available to view forever. I'm just curious, or I guess I want to identify, kind of just like the first step in starting that healing process. What would you recommend for somebody who might be, listening to us and thinking, oh, I've experienced that. I can relate to that. Maybe I need, to kind of start to peel back my layers. Where do they start? I think that can be a really overwhelming to take that first step. And it is so important.
I think, as Gabriella said earlier, that healing can come from so many different sources. So it's hard for us as practitioners to say, well, go to this website or, do this yoga practice or whatnot. I think whatever a person is intuitively drawn to that feels supportive is where I would say to start. And Gabriella also said that community is crucial. I agree 100%, whether that be a 12-step community or yoga people or people who just like dogs. I don't know. I don't care what it is, as long as you are finding some sort of community and a way to where you feel like you can play with that, getting back in connection. Because Gabriella was right on that sometimes folks who've experienced trauma really struggle with that connection. So I wish I could give a prescription right now, but I can't. That's kind of how I feel about it.
That's absolutely right. There is no one size fits all. And as much as we would love to have really, really, clear roadmaps and magic wands, kind of part of the blessing and maybe the curse is that none of that exists and that we get to kind of cultivate that on our own. I would say a potential first step is in, when you are experiencing those different things that make our bodies feel unsafe, that make us feel like, I feel so out of control. What is happening, right? When we feel any of those things that feel scary or that are like negative, like that negative self-talk, right? Those different pieces, to be able to add to it. I'm doing the best I can in this moment. To be able to add to it, there is my body trying to protect myself.
Mm-hmm.
That when we can notice that, okay, our legs are shaking, I feel so out of control. And it's like, oh, blood is actually rushing to my legs in case I have to run away. This is actually a really genius way that my body is trying to keep me as safe as possible, right? So just kind of adding that thought. I have found for myself and for a lot of people can help to start to just help us feel a little more kind of grounded in what can feel very like we are just kind of floating in the ocean at the whim of the waves, right?
Yeah, and I definitely do agree. Like I said, we see that everyone's path is unique and everyone's healing journey is unique. So I do appreciate you for sharing those sentiments. And so, we're getting a little close to the end of our time here. So I do want to give you both an opportunity. I'm out of questions, but if there's anything that you have not said today that you would like to share, any closing remarks that you would like to share, I want to give you that opportunity now, because I know that my questions are from a somewhat uninformed perspective. So there might be something left in your brain. So I want to give you that opportunity. You're still on mute.
Yeah, I was saying, oh, wow. So the thing I would offer is that, a lot of times there's a lot of different ways of understanding substance use. There's a lot of different models, and that everyone's kind of healing, recovery, however we want to name that process, because even how we name it can be so unique. I remember talking with folks that's like, the word recovery it's not relevant to me, right? Like for me, it's healing. And I remember talking to other people that is like, no, it's just about getting healthy for me, right? So like, even the way we talk about it can be labeling, right? So whatever that process is for folks, whatever that entails, that knowing that it's so individual, and yet we can share so many of those experiences together, and it can be so powerful when we do connect and share our truths, share our experiences, and are in an accepting place. Right. So not sharing it and then being re-victimized, but sharing it and feeling acceptance, really truly being accepted. And that there are some models that are going to say, like, you have to be accountable, and that's where healing comes from. And that works for some people. For other people, that feels incredibly shaming. And any sense of accountability is going to actually come with healing, not before. And, some people might say, we're not here to talk about trauma. We're here to talk about substance use. And guess what? Talking about the trauma for a lot of people is how we heal. And not always, not necessarily. Sometimes we can just talk about the here and now and the future and heal the trauma, right? And so there's a lot of models out there, and don't beat yourself up with taking these models as absolute truths. Find what makes sense to you. Find what makes your soul sing and follow that. Get into those spaces, find those people. And that's where the healing is. And that'll change over time too. And that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just add that, we're hurt in relationship, so we heal in relationship. And I think that also involves our relationship with ourselves. And so my wish, I know that this is not possible for everyone, but my wish for anybody struggling with trauma is that they do find someone in their lives who can be that non-judgmental, unconditional, positive regard. And I guess what I would challenge listeners to do also is to be that person for somebody else, right? Because the more that we can make that choice to be non-judgmental with someone who might be showing up with some symptoms of trauma, the more it's going to spread, and then the more people will be available. And I also wanted to share a free resource for anybody who has access to the internet. I host a podcast called Transforming Trauma that's by the NARM Training Institute. And I interview professionals who work in the trauma field, and we talk about healing. And it's really all about our human ability to transform after we've experienced trauma. So for anyone who wants to look that up, wherever you get your podcasts.
We will put that in the comments. Perfect. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today and, sharing your perspective on the topic. I do really appreciate it. It's been really great to get to know you both a little bit better. And so that's all.
Thanks so much for having us. And I'm always honored when I get to spend time with Gabriella. So I love that you agreed to do this with us.
Likewise. Thank you so much for including me. It's been such a pleasure to talk with you both today and get to share some really great information. And I look forward to sharing the recording with my networks as well.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you both again and have a great day.
Thanks, you too.
Bye.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in today. I hope that you found this conversation to be impactful. I know I did. I do want to share with you all that this will unfortunately be my last Hope Talk. I have resigned from my role at Southside Center of Hope, which has been a very difficult decision for me to make. But I am excited to start a new chapter in my life. I'm very thankful for the leadership that I have received in this role. I'm very thankful and honored to have had the opportunity to work with our executive director, Yasa Haggad. I'm also grateful for the leadership and mentorship that I've received from our board of directors. I'm thankful for the opportunity I've had to host Hope Talks for the last year. It's been one of my favorite parts of my job, of my time here with Southside Center of Hope. And I do want to say that this won't be the last you see of me. I will remain active on our Young Professionals Board. I will remain active as a donor and volunteer to the organization. Southside Center of Hope has a mission that I hold very dear to my heart. And as I will be transitioning out of my role, that does not mean that I will be caring any less about the women that we serve. So thank you everyone for tuning into Hope Talks for the last year. Thank you for supporting me in this role. Thank you for liking and interacting with our posts on Facebook. Please make sure to stay tuned. And to learn more about Southside Center of Hope, you can always visit our website, www.sscoh.org. And that is all for today. Thank you again.